department that's protecting citizens from high crimes, violence, and no support on the state level to protect them. So I think that people need to understand, what does it mean to defund the police? It means to eradicate a force in a department that's protecting citizens from rape, from abuse, from potential crimes, robbery, homicides, and all of the above. So I do not support any legislation, any bill that's being put forward to defund the police department. I think it's ignorant. I think it's irresponsible, and we need to do better.
When people say defund the police, certainly there's a radical fringe segment that wants to abolish the police and get rid of law enforcement. But there's a much larger contingent of people who, when they say that, see an opportunity to talk about much needed reforms that can be made. I fall into the latter camp. I'm not talking about abolishing the police. As a matter of fact, I'm not even talking about reducing salaries. What I'm talking about is making some major reforms, some of which by nature will involve some level of defunding. First and foremost, we should not be giving federal funds to agencies that violate civil rights. Secondly, we should end the 1033 program and get weapons of war off of America's streets. Third, we should end the war on drugs, which has been an abject failure. Fourth, police should not be the main responders for mental health crises. That should be mental health professionals. And lastly, we should get rid of the practice of civil asset forfeiture, where police can essentially take people's assets without convicting them of a crime. These aren't radical proposals. A lot of these have bipartisan support.
Hello, I'm David Grasso, and you're watching Bold TV. Today's burning question: should we defund the police? Let's hear from our panelists. First, we have Brandon Tatum. He's an ex-police officer and co-founder of #Blexit. And joining him is Dan King, a senior contributor to Young Voices and Civil Liberties Activists. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so there's been a call by activists to defund police departments around the country. Do you agree? Brandon, let's start with you.
No, I do not agree with defunding the police department. I think it's a misnomer or a false statement for individuals to say, no, we just want to take and divert money. That's not true. Most people are trying to eliminate the police department. You can see this in Minneapolis and other major metropolitan cities that have made a commitment to just completely obliterate the police department. That's not going to happen. Most people who say they want to defund the police department cannot articulate any one area that would be beneficial to reducing or even cutting funds to a police department that essentially, in my personal opinion, needs more training, needs more funding and support. So I do not support any avenue or conversation about defunding the police department.
Okay, Dan, let's hear from you. What do you have to say about this?
Brandon's got a point that some folks certainly go too far with it. I would never call for abolishing the police. I would never call for getting rid of law enforcement. But what I would call for is rethinking how we allocate resources. For example, we spend $30 billion a year fighting the war on drugs. We spend $9 million a day incarcerating people for drug offenses. Now imagine if we took those resources and instead of investing them in incarcerating people where they can't get the treatment they need, we invested that money in mental health services, we invested that money in addiction treatment, we invested that money in education, communities, and businesses. We would live in a safer community, people would get the treatment they need, and law enforcement's resources and time would be freed up to go after the murders, the rapes, the assaults, and the robberies that go unsolved each and every day.
Yeah, Brandon, would you agree with that? You know, something like the war on drugs is a waste of money, and maybe we can move on from that?
No, it sounds good. It sounds good as a talking point, but it's not really applicable. As a former police officer, you talk about the war on drugs. You're talking about individuals who are using drugs, abusing drugs, and then they're leading down the path of criminal activity. The people who are robbing individuals, people who are murdering individuals, people who are raping individuals also have a problem with abusing drugs. A normal, sane individual do not commit crimes to the level that we see in some of our communities. People who abuse drugs do. Now, I want to make this quick point. As a former police officer, we used to take people to jail and they get treatment. They have treatment programs. They can be put on probation where they have to adhere to certain, I guess, drug tests and things to make sure that they're not abusing drugs continually. Those things are already in place. I don't understand why we feel like we can't hold people accountable for breaking the law and then also get them treatment on the back end as well.
So, Dan, one of the things that I keep on hearing, is the abuse of police unions, right? That there's no accountability, that, cops really don't respond to criticism or reporting, or, there's a big problem with accountability, as I said. What do you have to say about that?
So I think accountability is a concern, and I think it should be a concern for good cops, because there are plenty of good cops out there who want to serve their community. They want to make their community safer, and a lot of them are doing that. Something I would look at is qualified immunity. An officer who violates somebody's civil rights should be held accountable in civil court. They should not be exempt from this. And police unions do a disservice to good cops when they stand by bad cops.
Yeah, Brandon, I have a question too. I'm old enough to remember the 90s when crime was a serious issue in most of our nation's cities. Do you feel like this pattern of defunding the police will cause a rise in crime in places like New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, etc.?
Yeah, we've already